Let's check another headline. This one from the Washington Post. New ACLU report takes a snapshot of police militarization in the United States. Specifically, the report looks at the way that SWAT teams are using the weapons of war. My guest now is Radley Balko, the writer of that Washington Post article. He's also written a book, Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of America's police forces. Radley, good to see you. After 10 years plus of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of hardware is coming home. Where is it ending up?
Well, a lot of it's ending up at police departments across the country, and we're not even talking about big city police departments. These MRAPs, these mine-resistant armored personnel carriers that are designed, to withstand blasts from IEDs, are ending up at places like the Ohio State University Police Department, or in tiny sheriff's departments and police departments in little towns across the country. This is stuff that was designed for use on a battlefield, that's being used, in American streets and in American neighborhoods.
Well, is there a need for it? I imagine law enforcement might be saying, look, we don't know what we're up against. We don't know what's on the other side of that door. It's a good thing that the federal government is making this available to us.
Sure, and you hear this argument a lot. A lot of police officers will say that we live in an increasingly violent society, that police officers work in war zones. There's just not a lot of data to back that up. The violent crime rate has been dropping pretty dramatically since 1994. And police officers themselves, last year was the safest year for police officers in a century. Fewer officers were killed on the job than any time since the early 50s, and the rate was the rate of homicide was lower than any time since the early 1900s. So, society's getting safer. At the same time, the police are getting increasingly militarized. And the other problem is, SWAT teams, there's a legitimate use for them, and that's when you have an emergency situation where lives are at immediate risk. So if you think hostage takings or bank robberies or, a terrorist incident. The problem is that these tactics and weapons are increasingly being used to serve search warrants on people who are still only suspected of crimes, and usually those crimes are pretty low-level drug crimes. We're even seeing SWAT used for white-collar crimes, for regulatory violations. This is a level of force that was once reserved as a last resort to save lives. It's increasingly being used as a first resort under the argument that we have to do whatever we can to protect police officers. And I think it's making things less safe for cops and citizens.
In other words, the argument that gets advanced in that ACLU data and that you made in your book, which I read and found very interesting, is that if you provide these bells and whistles to local law enforcement, they're going to be more inclined to use that equipment in a very routine kind of process or procedure.
Correct. And look, when you're using SWAT for legitimate reasons, you're using violence to diffuse an already violent scenario. When you're using SWAT to serve search warrants, when you're breaking into people's homes in the middle of the night with, battering rams and flash grenades, you're actually creating violence and confrontation where there was none before, and that's really the difference.
It would seem to me that there's also a concern about maintenance cost. So maybe I'm Mayberry RFD somewhere in the United States, and I'm offered an MRAP, and in law enforcement, with the best of intentions, I say, geez, that would be great in order to have that equipment. Who the hell knows what's going to come? But when the transmission goes bad or when the tire needs replacing, where exactly do I turn to repair it?
Yeah, the maintenance costs can be very expensive, and the Army itself, actually, in a newsletter a few months ago, recommended against using MRAPs even at U.S. military bases, because they said that they had a very specific purpose, which was to protect soldiers in these convoys in Iraq and Afghanistan. That on paved streets in the United States, they're actually unsafe. They tear up the streets. They have a high rollover potential. And the other thing to keep in mind is in the military, you need hours of training before you can drive one of these things, or before you can operate a lot of this equipment that police departments are getting. Police officers, when they get this stuff, aren't getting that training. And then they're using that equipment, again, in American streets and American neighborhoods. And that, I think, is disconcerting. I mean, we're sort of giving, the citizens of the countries where we're fighting more protection than we are American citizens from this stuff.
Radley, just a minute left between us. Do you think that part of the reason there hasn't been more of a public backlash to this whole program of war machinery coming to Main Street USA is that people, by the way in which the news is presented in this country, misperceive the data? They think that we're living in the most dangerous era of man's existence when exact opposite of that is actually true.
2 points very quickly. First, I think you're right. Polls still show that about 60% of the country thinks crime is getting worse, even though, as I said, it's been getting dramatically better for about 20 years. The other thing is that, these tactics for a long time have been primarily used against low-income minority communities, people who don't have a lot of clout or a platform. As it expands and it's starting to hit middle-class communities, and as these tactics are being used for white-collar crimes, I think you are starting to see the political class, take notice. It's an unfortunate kind of political reality, but I think it is a situation where, as it gets worse, that's probably the best hope for it getting better.
Radley Balko, thanks so much for being here.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
You remember that original headline? A new ACLU report takes a snapshot of police militarization in the United States. What I would have written? Soldiers return to Main Street. So does their weaponry.